back, everyone. Glad to have you here with me today as we continue this endeavor, diving into knowing ourselves more and, more importantly, getting to know this internal world more. I mean, let's face it, whenever things are not going the way we want in our life, when things get tied in a knot, when things go smash in our life, and they do so in a pattern of ways, it's an active mind that's creating this. I'm your host. This is the Subconscious Healer, Dr. Gabe Roberts. Today, let's talk a little bit about just briefly kind of touch on manifesting, because I had somebody ask this question. When it comes to my work, is manifesting part of it? And the answer is yes, because let's face it, your mind is a manifesting generator, always creating things in your life. And it has to do with the way you think, the way that you think. And I'm not talking about consciously thinking, the thoughts you're thinking of, the way that you think has a direct impact on your life. And this may be, something that is new for some people, hard to understand for some people. Some people may not even believe it, but the reason they don't believe it, it all comes down to 17th century thinking that has been installed and wired in part of our educational system, and the way our universities teach knowledge, the way our classrooms, even our healthcare system, all of our research, all of them came from the mindset of Rene Descartes, who was born in 1591, the man who said, "I think, therefore I am." And this man, what was very very helpful in help us understanding the mechanical world of mathematics and algebra and things like that. But his view of the world being a mechanical, orderly, and predictable concept, which is true in mathematics and things like that, chemistry. Um, One of his theories was actually much more harmful than good, and it was this mechanistic idea. Rene Descartes himself was puzzled by the mind and said that it's beyond the mechanical laws. It works outside of this mechanistic, predictable law. And because he couldn't account for these variabilities that the mind had, he said the mind was subject and are not subject to the laws of this mechanistic, physical, and predictable world. So the mind was outside of the bounds of scientific exploration. And this led to a duality. This led to a split of view where matter, physical matter, predictable matter was the jurisdiction of science, and that did not include the mind. And the mind was God's jurisdiction. So mind was God's instrument. So it fell under the category, it fell under the jurisdiction of religion. And now this kind of mindset of, science looking at all the physical matter with no mind, and the mind was under the jurisdiction of religion with no physical matter. This kind of held itself for several hundred years. This duality system between these concepts of mind and matter stood as the accepted view. And then, of course, comes along Sir Isaac Newton, and his experiments and theories basically solidified these laws of this mechanistic, machine-like operating system that is, tells us how that our universe works like a machine. When a person has this kind of engraved conditioning within them, it's very easy for them to think that a concept of the way they think, the way they use their mind, couldn't possibly have anything to do with their life, and actually does. So Newton basically solidified that all things were physical, and that energy itself was just a force to move objects. Now, the important thing to understand is energy is the very fabric of all things in our material world. The work of Descartes and Newton established this mindset of this mechanistic principles that humanity basically doesn't have any influence on their outcomes. That's the whole reason I'm covering this, is this idea of this mechanistic world gives us an idea that we don't have any control of our world. So it leads us into a victim kind of mentality. And all of this reality is predetermined. It gives us a concept that our actions don't matter, and certainly our thoughts don't make any difference. So, why bother changing anything, right? This is what gives us a victim mentality. Now, 200 years later, we have in the Brussels Institute in 1927, Albert Einstein and a group of other scientists, including Marie Curie and John Wheeler. These scientists were brilliant minds. Half of them were Nobel Prize winners. The other half would go on to win the Nobel Prize. They got together in Brussels and they dissected this atom, which was so-called a solid particle at the time, and they found that the atom was a gray cloud of responsiveness, a cloud of responsiveness. That means matter appeared and disappeared. That means things appeared within view and disappeared out of view, just in unpredictable ways. So this was complete contrast to what we had known up to this point. And of course, that's where Albert Einstein gives his famous equation of energy equals, or E equals mc square, which means energy is equivalent to mass times the speed of light. So now mass times the speed of light is no longer considered a solid mechanical object. It means that energy and matter are completely interchangeable. And as these scientists agreed, as they started to appear, John Wheeler himself said that we are no longer in a observatory world. We're in a predictable, or I'm sorry, we're not in a predictable. We are participating in this world. We are no longer just watching a world. We are actually participants in this world. And how do we do that? Well, the same way these scientists did when they would peer into the internal component of this atom. Their observation alone made the information, the waveform information within this subatomic area change. It created mass. It turned waveform particles into physical particles. And this is, my friends, the very fabric of what we're getting at when we say the mind creates. If things are going wrong, it's an act of mind. This findings from these scientists in this time period, 1927, which was basically the birth of quantum mechanics, showed that mind and matter are not separate, but they are one and the same. Now, this directly contradicted Rene Descartes and Newtonian, despite that still being the dominant view of things going on in our modern society today. This showed the Newtonian model was absolutely flawed at the fundamental level, the subatomic. This showed the parts of the atom, which are electrons, protons, and neutrons, which are the building block of everything in our universe, both waves and particles, were responsive to who was observing it and how they observed it. So to understand how the world works, how the universe works, how our life works, how our relationships work, if our body has illness or not, we have to understand that manifestation is all part of that. We must observe the tiniest components, and that's that quantum physics, this field that Dr. Bruce Lipton has said the most valid of all science today. So the idea that things are mechanical, made of blocks and sticks, made of atoms that are solid objects, is absolutely false. It's not true at all. So when we talk about when we talk about these things, a lot of the things that we have to do to change our life, to change ourselves, to change the things that we don't like, we have to first observe that there's two worlds now going on. The internal world, which is within our own body, within ourself, and the external world outside of us, which is our relationships, our health part, as part of that, our if we're promoted at work, all those kind of things, how accident prone we are, all those seemingly that appear to be random things that are not random at all. Those things work because of this quantum mechanical this quantum mechanic interaction between things. And whenever something's not right, when we are having results that we don't like in our life, when things are just not happening for us that we want, we have to look at and understand that it's our internal world and our external world that do not line up. And they don't line up because there's parts of our internal world that are misaligned. There's parts of our internal world that are not lined up correctly. So whenever we're trying to create something in our life, we are actually doing this observer effect, creating particles in a very disharmonic way. If it's disharmonic, we're going to see chaos in some way. We're going to see things thrown off. We're going to see things not the way we want. So this work is all about beginning to align things correctly. And that's why in my book, I share something called holographic deletion, because a lot of the things that we want to correct in our life, where these misalignments begin to show up, are subtle body feelings when certain context comes up. So when we talk about these things with such magnitude that they're able to influence our life and even willing to kill us, if we have what's called a self-mutilation program, we should want to know what that something is. A vast array of illnesses, diseases, and disorders, along with all the healthy conditions, are the tools used by the subconscious mind that carries out and manifests our perception, as well as compensate for us and our contributions we have in life. And it does this in a very constructive way, as I just described the way that when we observe, it's our subconscious mind that is the one that influences those particles. It's our subconscious mind that influences the subatomic world. It's our subconscious mind that is the creative force within us. Each time we contribute to life in some way, we receive a complete set of feelings, body feelings. Each time we receive a compensation, that compensation brings a complete set of feelings, and how we emotionally react to that contribution and compensation is a measure and monitor of alignment. Negative feelings we don't like, are an indicator of malalignment or imbalance. Positive feelings indicate balance or alignment. So when we measure our alignment with the universal laws, it would be easy if it were not for the fact that this contribution and compensation are happening in some form every millisecond. At this rate, feelings get thrown around in such volume that the conscious mind's monitoring becomes impossible to even govern and understand. So this is why certain people become vulnerable. Outside influences, the things that happen to us between 0 to 5 years old, place specific feelings on these moments, and they take advantage of a person's inability to balance the current wave of emotion against a more upright thinking that only time will validate. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the poet, wrote in this Compensation, that was the name of it, that life invents itself with inevitable conditions, which the unwise seek to dodge, which one and another brags that he does not know, brags that they do not touch him. But the brag is on his lips, the conditions are on his soul. If he escapes them in one part, they attack him in another, more vital spot. If he has escaped them in form and in the appearance, it is because he has resisted his life and fled from himself. And the retribution is so much death. I like that. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson's uh, Compensation. That's his poem, Compensation. And the part that's really sticks out is the very last line. And the retribution is so much death. Here, Emerson speaks of the outcomes of the wretched. He might happily point out that he who accepts his life and embraces it faces it as retribution, so much life. So this means that life for us all becomes one apothecary scale. One of the pans hold all the perception that move us in line with universal laws. No good and health, happiness, well-being. These things happen when our inner perceptions align in that way. We will label this pan good. The other pan holds the perceptions that drag us away from universal laws. Bad, destructive things happen when we get out of line with those laws. We've marked this pan as bad. As life comes at us, whenever things happen, the ebb and flow, whatever contexts we find ourselves in, we act and react to life's happenings in certain ways based on how our perceptions have us believing at the time. And those perceptions, again, are formed between 0 to 5 years old. That's why I said the internal world and the external world don't line up, because there's parts of our internal world that are misaligned. The alignment within us is a sum total of the vibrational information we send off to the universe. And again, if it's disharmonic, we can expect to see disharmonic results taking place in our life. And this comes down to you because there's parts of you deep down that want certain things at the expense of other things, and they're ultimately fighting for supremacy. That's why there's these body feelings. These show up as those unpleasant body feelings. And this is what I call the hot air balloon versus the sandbag analogy. Because when we're born into this world, when we're conceived, actually not born, we're 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 conceived in the image of God with limitless abilities. And between the age of 0 to 5, depending on the load, depending on the environment, depending on where we're at, we start to get sandbags strapped to us. We start to get these sandbags that start to accumulate. And once that happens, we become adults. We have ideas about what we want to do. We decide that we want to set goals, maybe even have vision boards. And what we're ultimately doing, getting getting determined to move forward in our life towards a goal, yet we have these sandbags. This is the equivalent of adding high octane fuel to that, the thrust to the flame inside of that hot air balloon, pulling it harder, using more thrust, more heat. And ultimately, what we're actually doing with those sandbags attached is just creating more drag. So we're creating more drag. Those are the things that keep us from doing things, the things that keep us from being motivated in certain ways, dragging our feet in certain areas, not able to heal, not able to achieve the success we want. Whatever it is, becoming more productive, having alignments within ourself. That all comes down to the difference between the drag from these sandbags and the thrust in the hot air balloon. And that is that ebb and flow between the sandbags you're having the drag, and the thrust in the hot air balloon lifting is basically the formula for how far we get in our life and how fast we get there. That's what it is. And the important thing about holographic deletion, a technique in the book, is it will actually help you start to cut these sandbags off. And once those cut off, you're moving forward with much more ease. So, like I said, if we think about the good experiences and we learn positively from it, the way the experience is entered into that apothecary's pan, into that area labeled good. And holographic deletion helps you extract that information to learn from these. If we take the next experience to arise and we get tangled in the selfish wants or the egocentric judging of other people and things, the weight of that experience is actually entered into the pan labeled bad. In this instant, we take on the burden that are drawn away from the good, and we would consciously say that we are actually desiring. We take away, draw away from the good that we are consciously desiring. This process goes on and on continuously. As the critical faculty of the mind begins to accept or reject the bits and pieces of these new life experiences, what is allowed, though, is credited into one pan or the other. And as the scale starts to tip in one direction or the other, so does the person's condition. We have to remember that these are accumulating experiences, and nature will always seek to balance things out. Nature does not like imbalances. So as our scales in life tip towards the good pan or towards the bad pan, so does the person's condition. So does the events in the person. So does the things happening in that person's life. So this determines that the weight of the experience, good or bad, goes into that good pan or the bad pan. Is determination found in goodness or badness of the experience itself? No, not necessarily. An experience a person has is neither good nor bad. It's just an experience. The goodness or the badness of an experience is basically sensed and created by the way which each person individually handles that situation. And again, these will show up as body feelings. So whenever we have feelings we don't like, it's our job to get rid of them, because what we're doing is adding more and more accumulation into that bad pan. Let me talk briefly about the curse of perfectionism. And this is something that is really important because it comes into my work a lot. And this is one of the things that another huge, it's another huge contribution to why people can't move forward in life and why they seem to be paralyzed, but also why people develop chronic illness at times. The curse of perfectionism. Okay, we've discussed the importance of the initial sensitizing event many times, and it's the perceptions that are made at this time whenever we're 0 to 5 that are accepted without judgment and then used as a model, basically, that the person interprets as truth, against which everything else after that is judged. So what that means is the very first experiences between 0 to 5 become the measuring apparatus of everything else that happens in that person's life. I've also mentioned that the initial sensitizing event lies dormant unless its underlying message to the subconscious mind is compounded through secondary sensitizing events. So, in the case of terminal illness, my work has shown that most times that initial seed planting turns out to be some fear based action by mom, by dad, parents that makes the infant feel as though mom and dad would be happier or better off if the infant would just be gone. And I can promise you that this remains amazingly consistent. So, what happens to these secondary sensitizing events leading to sickness? What do they look like? Well, these are most destructive when they organize themselves into something known as the curse of perfectionism. So the first thing I wanted to differentiate between perfection and perfectionism. Perfection and perfection and perfectionism are complete opposites of the scale. They're at opposite ends of a very powerful spectrum. And when I say that, I mean it this way. You will learn that my favorite definition of love is to look for the good. My favorite definition of love is to only see the best in that person, to welcome that person in your presence and be filled with joy that they're there. Perhaps you've heard the words God is love and God is perfect. And if we're all perfect within his eyes, well, then if to love is to look for the good, then we could say that his perfection comes out in his ability to see all the good and only the good in everyone and everything. So we are all perfect in the sense that no matter what we find ourselves doing or thinking, the universe response to these contributions will hold our most important lessons. Each experience placed in front of us is then perfect in the sense that it's exactly what we need at that moment for us to learn and for us to grow. So we're all perfect in the sense that we're allowed to be just who we are in that very moment and okay with things and happy with who we are. Now, perfectionism says just the opposite of everything we've just claimed as perfection. Perfectionism is the idea that no matter what we do, there's another stage and another level that we should be working to achieve. And because we aren't there, we're less than perfect. So when we talk about God's perfection and the perfectionism, I'm sorry, the perfection of each and every one of us, that is the opposite end of the spectrum of perfectionism. So perfection and perfectionism are on the opposite end of scale. So let's separate those two. I know it's a little bit confusing, but we want to make sure that we really separate those two because they're opposites of a very powerful spectrum. Everything is perfect. Who you are right now in this moment is perfect. The idea of perfection is something we will later discuss, but for now, let's look at that curse of perfectionism. Now, the word curse is a pretty strong word, and as a professional, I try very hard to keep my work closely, distinctly different from what people would consider a cult. And now all of a sudden, I'm using this word curse. So I take note and listen to see if there was anywhere else in my conversation, but nowhere in that phrase, curse of perfectionism, um, there's no other word to kind of describe it other than a curse. The perfectionism thing must be mighty bad for that kind of word. So look at it. Let's examine this and determine why it's so bad. So my definition of perfectionism is when people drive themselves compulsively where nothing they do is ever good enough. There's always something more they should be doing or accomplishing. They perform and instantly surmise everything that was wrong with their performance, and they ultimately feel like they betrayed themselves. This curse of perfectionism is a trait of people that have chronic illness, the automatic compulsive concern for emotional needs of others while completely disregarding their own emotional needs. That is a key finding with everyone that has some kind of malignancy, some kind of autoimmune, people that have chronic illness. Those are the number one, that's one of the number one characteristics, compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while disregarding their own. They also have a repression, a denial of healthy anger. So they bury their anger deep down. Remember in a few podcasts ago, I talked about the uh, the munition example of altering the charge by just changing the casing shape. And I explained a rifle barrel exploding that's corked. When a person denies healthy, self-protective boundary protection of anger by not saying no when they should, this is a sign of the curse of perfectionism. They're overdriven and they have an obsession with external focused multitasking, like a hyper responsibility. And it's based on deep seated beliefs that they must justify their own self by doing and by giving. And usually in such an excessive way that they're really stressing themselves out. Now, on the outside, these people appear the nicest people ever. They're the ones that don't want conflict. They don't say no. They're always saying yes. They're always volunteering to do all the things that you know, trying to be a people pleaser. I'll say it that way. And this also translates to a rigid, unflexible identification with a social role. And this includes within family, this includes within work and duties and all responsibilities. They will not say no when they should say no. And it's because of this curse of perfectionism has them saying no because they feel like they can't handle something. They feel like they have to be good to deserve being loved because they feel like they betray themselves anything less than that. And they feel like if I say no, I'm not lovable. I'm responsible for how other people feel and what they experience, and I must not disappoint anyone. Telltale sign of a curse of perfectionism. They feel like they're not worthy unless they're doing something useful. And they also feel like if people knew how they really felt deep down, that the people wouldn't like them. So they feel like they betray themselves. For everyone who has a tendency like that, uh, do they have fun in those moments? Do they have fun when they say no? Or I'm sorry, when they do they have fun in those moments when they say yes and they want to say no? The answer is absolutely not. Is there a joy and peace in that person's living? The answer is no. Were they born with it? Is it their destiny? Is it a part of the universal law that says you must feel like this and nothing you do or feel is right until you're perfect? No. So, where does this pain come from? The pain of perfectionism and being a perfectionist comes down to this: through human eyes, there's no perfection. That is what divine is all about. That's what God is all about. He is set apart and beyond us, and his ability to see all the good and only the good in everyone and everything. So, atonement is to become totally at one with God. Now, if you're not one with him, you can still reach down and pinch your arm and notice that, hey, you're still flesh and blood, which means that you're still something less than perfect through anyone else's eyes but God's. So this means you interpret yourself as being anything less than perfect through anyone else's eyes but God's. Now, you can't see anything as totally perfect. That means that in this physical plane, through human eyes, a person, no matter how saintly, has sinned, and a person, no matter how vile, has virtue. We are all, in one way, shape, or form, a mixed bag through human eyes. The old saying that comes around once in a while, there's an old saying that every cloud there's a silver lining implies that within every silver lining there's a cloud. So everyone, every experience, and everything is a mixed bag of good and bad through human eyes. This points to the power that the definition of love that I have defined earlier, to look for the good, only see the best in others, is is a really, really good definition. And why? It explains that one person can be loved by thousands, but the exact same moment be hated by somebody else, be hated by equal numbers. Well, how can that be? A person can't change in the moment. Remember that through human eyes, there's no uh, perfection. This means there's no perfect good, and that sounds pretty sad. But it also guarantees us that there can be no perfect evil, and that's a good thing. So two groups lock up one person. The first group chooses to look for the good. There can be no perfect evil, so the good has to be there in some proportion. So when they look for the good, they find it. And when they find the good, they can find the love. The other group, for whatever their program or conscious decision making, chooses to look for the bad. Well, it had to be there in some proportion, so they find it too. And when they find the bad, they find the hate. So to love is to look for the good. To hate is to look for the bad. And no matter who we stare at, we have the choice to do either. And we will find whichever one we choose. That's all there is to it. Remember, like I told you earlier, about how observing creates. And as we look to ourselves and our own performances in that same critical fashion, we'll always find some kind of room for critiquing. We will always find something we're doing wrong, something that's inadequate, something that's not good enough. And with this obsession comes incredible frustration, pain, hopelessness, and it's the nature of the over and underachiever. When we're totally guilt ridden of the inadequacies of our own performance as we see through our own eyes, the calling for self punishment is close to follow. A lot of chronic illness, like I just mentioned, characteristics from a lot of the chronic illness, a lot of disease, malignancy comes from this seed planted through the curse of our own perfectionism. A lot of broken relationships result from this curse of perfectionism. When we're not only force ourselves to be perfect, which is unachievable, but then expect it out of our loved ones, life gets to be a really nasty journey that can be very lonely. The constant criticism and nitpicking brought on by a family fabric that can drive the rest of the family absolutely crazy. It happens at the workplace, and it actually destroys productivity. It happens in our home, and it happens in our own hearts. So here's where it comes from. Think of life as a learning plane where we come to learn and grow from what we have to call human experiences. It says, and we brought out a spiritual realm where, it says that when we are brought out of the spiritual realm and we choose a life in the realm of flesh and blood, we enter this world only knowing God's love, peace, and harmony and bliss. This is something that has come up in my experience, my research in what are called near death experiences. So then, in time, some experience takes place that gives us our first taste of pain or of negativity. And that's the initial sensitizing event. And like I said before, it's the first event in life, the first seed planting, the first external experience that sort of hits us like a pie in the face and says, hey, you know, welcome to the party, pal. And that's usually the moment that we buy into the illusion of negativity, when we start to believe that we've done something wrong and we deserve pain. And from there, it starts to build and build and build. So a beautiful child born of love and of God is born into the world, doesn't have much of those beautiful things. Born into a world that doesn't have much of those beautiful things. Let's say the parents of this child were love starved themselves as children, and no one ever taught them anything different. There's no real love or peace surrounding the child now, and the parent's attitude is mostly negative and distance and maybe even criticism. But the child still has this can do spirit that we all have when we're born with in the beginning. So, right about here, people ask, well, why are we always blaming things on our parents? Why do the parents take a number of the blame? It's not the parents or the parenting is bad or that we're blaming them as people. It is the fact that we are products of our environment. And those earliest of years are the most vital and crucial in all of our years. When we're born into the world, our parents make up most of that environment, no matter what our conscious level of intent, no matter what their level of conscious intent. Parents cannot pass on to their children what they themselves don't have. So, out of the goodness of my heart, I may want to, you know, give a yacht to a homeless person. I may want to pass over and give person a yacht, $1 million yacht to a homeless person. But no matter what my intent, if I don't own a yacht, I can't pass it over to that person. So when two love starved people come into the world and bear into this world a child that may have the conscious intent to shower that child with love, the stuff they didn't get when they were young, but if they have never received it on their own and they have not done their own cleansing, they haven't done their own trauma healing, they end up giving that child what they themselves were subject to when they were that age. For most children of love starved parents, it is distance and it's criticism. So the parents will ignore the child until the child cries for attention. Then the child gets a bottle or a blanket or they change the diaper, and the child continues to cry. So the parents get more and more aggravated and more frustrated. And then maybe the words come out like, you drive mommy nuts. And mommy's thinking the kid doesn't have a vocab. The child, it's an infant maybe. It doesn't have a vocab and it doesn't know what those words mean. And mom could be thinking to herself with her rational lying brain, I'm just venting anger to keep my sanity. So she probably will say something like, you drive mommy nuts. However, she doesn't realize that those words go deep into the subconscious mind of the child, are recorded and imprinted. They become part of that child's perception of who he or she is. Over time, the parents continue to criticize the child for her inconveniences to mom, inconveniences to dad. This kind of parent wants the child to somehow just figure life out and become naturally good at it. If the child ever falls short of this expectancy, he or she gets punished and criticized for making a mistake. Now, see, this is not good. This is a real slippery slope, and this becomes something very, very bad We don't learn through our successes. We learn from our mistakes as humans on this human plane. We learn through trial and error. And this is essential for how we develop. So let's say this child knocks over a glass of milk and the parent treats the event of something to be punished or scolded instead of a mistake to be learned from. I've seen this show up many times in my work. In movie talk, if we're going to talk about how films are made and actors and movies, mistakes call for retakes. And we know the situation on this, whenever they're filming a movie and they say, okay, take one, and the little clip snaps, take two, take three, take four until they succeed, right? So if Hollywood directors scorned every mistake, can you imagine a Hollywood director scorning like Robert De Niro or Leonardo DiCaprio or someone for every mistake? You could imagine the actors would quickly mutate into something unusable. Their behaviors would by creating uh, this kind of environment. The actors would quickly disappear. But by treating mistakes positively and lightheartedly, movie outtakes offer laughs and can sometimes, if you watch a movie and then you watch the later part of it and you watch the mistakes, you know, um, the part where they do things and they start laughing about it, oftentimes those laughs can outperform the movie itself. Now, going back to our little analogy, we have an innocent child with a can-do spirit and all of God's energy still percolating freshly inside of them. So, as we follow the upbringing to see how this curse of perfectionism is born, the child with this can do nature hears the words, "You drive mommy nuts," and thinks to themselves, "Mommy and daddy aren't happy with me. I can make them happier. I can do better and I can make them smile." But the problem is the anger coming from mom or dad towards the child has absolutely nothing to do with the child. It only has to do with their unresolved traumas, their unresolved pain, and their unresolved suffering that's still percolating within the parent's own subconscious mind. If the parents are programmed to criticize, even if that child were mere millimeters from perfect in their performance, the parents would still find something only to criticize simply because that's their programming. In fact, they have no choice. Their perceptual filters cannot view the positive, will only view the negative. Like I mentioned earlier, that scale. So they, in fact, have no choice. Their perceptual filters will only rearrange the data in their environment so they hone in and zero in on the mistakes. They have no choice about it. So they criticize the child, and the child starts to have the perception internally of, well, gee, I tried and I can do better, and I'm trying hard, and mom and dad are still upset. I can do better. I can do better. I can make them happy. So now the child tries to do better, but he or she is learning from trial and error. As the trial occurs, the child makes another error, makes another mistake, and yet the parent criticizes and yells again. The child's still got that can do spirit, the positive spirit that they're come to this earth with, that's their soul. But yet, each time this criticism and yelling happens, that positive spirit is a little weaker and a little weaker. And if you could sense what's going on inside that child, you could actually sense their exhaustion. But the child still continues, I can do better. There's got to be a way. I can do it. I can make mom and dad happy. And he or she tries to do their best. But whatever the best is, the parents, the teachers, the coach, whoever it might be, their own critical programs are still running and finding something to criticize. And all that criticism goes in and compounds all other critiques. So now the child's subconscious mind begins to really get the impression of, gee, I must be really lousy. I tried my hardest and nothing's good enough. I must do better. Sometimes now getting really fatigued. That positive spirit is much weaker now, getting lethargic and maybe even a little angry. The child tries to do better, but since he or she can't succeed because they cannot be perfect in the eyes of a parent programmed to be set for criticism. This pattern continues, and it continues over year after year during that primal time when the child's self image is developing. And then one day it happens. It stacks and stacks and stacks until one day it breaks through. Now, this little can do mind of the child, so weak and so desperate, looking for a way to please mom and dad, thinks suddenly they think these words, and it may be of the conscious level, but it's definitely forming at the subconscious level. The child's mind says, maybe if I'm perfect, then mom and dad can't yell at me anymore. Maybe if I'm perfect, then mom and dad can't yell at me anymore. And that is the birthing of the curse of perfectionism. At this moment, the child is now programmed to accept something they can never achieve as the only level of acceptable performance. They're only looking to achieve something that they cannot do. Remember this, there can be no perfection through human eyes. So he or she could never see themselves as perfectly good. They've been trained to look for the bad in themselves. The bad must be in there to some proportion. And so they always find it. And when they find the bad, when they find that negativity, when they observe it, they actually create it. Now the program for punishment, for self-punishment, kicks into gear. And this is the beginning of the end. Now, as that child, he or she, looks at themselves in the mirror, understanding perfectionism or understanding perfection to be the only answer that doesn't call for punishment. So they now have the interpretation that to be perfect is the only way to not call for punishment. Now, no matter how well they do, this child during any performance of their life will naturally focus on the parts of their performance that they see as inadequate. Criticism for the inadequacy quickly follows, and they continue to beat themselves up over and over and over again. Recall back to the law of compounding for a moment. The law of compounding states that as more perceptions come into the person's experience that match a previous perception, um, it starts to get stronger and more reinforced. So if I were to tell you the grass is green, you suddenly believe the grass is green just a little bit more. That perception is now just a little heavier. This is why I was able to say earlier the curse of perfectionism leads to chronic and terminal illness, because as new experiences confirm those inner callings, those callings grow stronger and stronger. And if the calling is a calling for self punishment over time, that calling for self punishment will only grow stronger. Because of this, the mind will not be satisfied next year with the tools that it used to inflict self punishment this year. Just the course of what's called natural progression tells us that total self destruction is the ultimate form of self punishment. Cancer, for instance, is certainly on the mind's list as a preferred tool for ultimate self annihilation. That's why cancer, you cannot fight cancer. You can't fight a program. You have to go back and change that program. And when you find cancer, there's nothing wrong. It's a program, a subconscious program running a perception and doing its job. The same with autoimmune, the same with chronic, illness. I can't tell you how many times I meet patients that have went through every kind of protocol necessary, taken suitcases of supplements, they've changed their lifestyle, they're detoxing, they're eating organic food, yet they still have symptoms. Why? There's a subconscious program running that has been overlooked and missed. So what we have to understand is total self-destruction is the ultimate form of self-punishment. The subconscious mind is the most powerful goal-achieving agency known to humanity, and it cannot judge a single decision put into it. It takes whatever is placed into it, moves it into form, whether it's good or bad, and that oftentimes is the case when you see these chronic illnesses.